Hello, Gary.
Hello.
Hello, welcome. Nice to see you, and great to have you at DKGcon 2024. I was just about to introduce you to the crowd, though I assume pretty much everybody knows who you are, but I'm just going to give a few sentences on who Gary Marcus is, and lately he's named as the leading AI critic. For a good reason. He was the one grilling Sam Altman in front of Congress very recently, which I'm going to ask you a question on later. But also cognitive scientist, entrepreneur, AI expert, studied under the legendary Steven Pinker, former professor of New York University for many years, co-founded 2 AI companies, Geometric Intelligence, Robust AI, and just recently published a book called Taming Silicon Valley: How Can We Ensure That AI Works for Us? I read most of the book. It's really good. I recommend you get it. Yeah, welcome again, Gary. The chat will be between myself, Branimir. I'm, again, founder and CTO behind OriginTrail. And yeah, we just had a really great conference today. This is almost at its end, but the final parts of it are usually the most juiciest ones, right? So we had conversations today, folks from Google, Amazon, Microsoft, experts from BSI, standardization organizations like GS1, builders. They all kind of focused around the problems of misinformation, deepfakes, hallucinations, undermining trust on the internet, centralization, IP protection issues. And generally, this has been kind of the theme of the day. So I'm curious, as an introduction, what's your opinion on the current state of AI space, and how would you reflect on these problems?
I've been warning about all those problems for quite a long time. That's why I wrote the book, but it's also why I've been active on Twitter and why I've been keeping a Substack and so forth. I think those are all very real problems: hallucinations, misinformation, the use of them in meddling in political campaigns. I think AI has probably made a wrong turn. I don't think it's an irreversible wrong turn, but if you think where we were, say, 10 years ago, I think the field was very healthy. There were many different alternative approaches. Money had not quite corrupted the field in the same way. I think a greater proportion of people was working on things like AI for medicine, though of course some still are. And chatbots got popular and everybody rushed in, including a lot of grifters who were like, from the NFT world or something like that, trying to find a new home. And the valuations went up, and it's changed, I think, what the big companies do and how some of the large startups are thinking about things. And right now it's kind of money grab. It's a money grab that's going to ultimately involve, I think, a large scale surveillance like we've never seen before. I think OpenAI, and we could talk about this, is going to be pushed towards surveillance. And I think the LLMs that are so popular are both morally and technically inadequate. So they're morally inadequate because it's much easier for bad actors to use these tools than for good actors. Like in the way that spam doesn't have to work that well. If you use robocalls to try to influence people or try to do phishing expeditions or whatever, it doesn't have to work that well. And so bad actors are having a field day with this stuff. And a lot of the promised good things aren't really working. And I think we'll get to the technical side. On the technical side, the current systems just don't understand factuality. Their ability to reason is limited. I think that puts an upper bound on the positive uses, but sort of counterfeiting people doesn't require perfection in the way that a lot of good uses do. So right now, I don't know whether generative AI has been a net negative, but it certainly hasn't been a huge net positive. There are a lot of downside risks to it. And I would like to see the field of AI trying to build better, safer, more reliable AI instead of just rushing out these chatbots, which are mostly there to trick people.
That resonates very much with all the conversations today, including the previous one introduced by Ben. I think I even saw a quote by you saying that deep learning is all the hype, but deep understanding is what we actually need. And
well, my earlier book was all about that. I mean, we used the phrase deep understanding. This was the book one of my earlier books. This was the book with Ernie Davis, Rebooting AI. And that was the conclusion, is that deep learning is not going to get us to AGI or to trustworthy AI. That was 5 years ago, and some people would say there have been huge advances, but I don't think there have been huge advances towards trustworthiness, towards interpretability, towards getting rid of bias. And in fact, I think in some ways there's a step back. So there is a lot of positive advance if all you want is an LLM for brainstorming. Like, it's way better for that. Let's be honest. And they've found value in coding, although we could also argue about what the long-term benefit is of that. But we are still lacking deep understanding as much as we were 5 years ago.
That's a very good point. And I believe that, at least from my knowledge, that you've been one of the earliest advocates for a hybrid neuro-symbolic approach that we've been talking about throughout the day, and Ben was highlighting as well. Many experts seem to be converging on that idea today. We mentioned Jan LeCun today, Turing Award winner. He talks about a world model, which is necessary in order for the AI to actually understand what's going on, and for this deep understanding. I believe you called it the cognitive model in your in your work.
In my 2020 article, The Next Decade in Archive, which I think is still pretty relevant, a whole section of the paper was about cognitive models. World model is just another label for that. It's a very old idea. I mean, people have been using world models in AI since the 1950s. And explicit world models that you could interrogate. So like right now I have a model that you're in an auditorium, not that much of which I can see. You're at a lectern, you're wearing a t-shirt, I'm being projected, or a representation of me is being projected on the screen and so forth. So I have all of those things in my head. I can reason about them. If you all left and I heard a fire alarm, I could guess that it wasn't something that I said that offended you, but rather you were concerned about it. And so we can make all of these inferences about world models. I've been trying to emphasize for a long time that you can't really do AI without them. LeCun has come in lately and he's trying to make it sound like he invented the idea. He certainly did not. It precedes, I think, even his birth and certainly mine.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting you put it that way. The community here at this conference, which is the OriginTrail community, has been actually working on creating an open source and transparent system, which actually is a decentralized system called the Decentralized Knowledge Graph, where we actually aim to create such a world model in real time by crowdsourcing all of this information. And we've been doing quite a lot of work over the years, and we've just seen 9 builders actually, not 10, presenting. And as knowledge obviously comes in many forms and often questionable sources, we're really looking for good principles on how to build this as a robust foundation. And I remember you specifically suggesting several principles for a better foundation for AI. You were explicitly calling it a better one. Could you perhaps touch upon that?
I'm not sure I can do all 7. I think it was from memory, but I can probably get most of them. Having world models or cognitive models is absolutely fundamental. Having ability to generalize abstract knowledge is fundamental. What we see in LLMs is always piecemeal. They don't really understand any abstract principles. So this is why they have trouble with arithmetic, or lately we've seen these river crossing problems they have a lot of trouble with. So a man and a woman in a boat have to get across, and they just confuse it with other similar problems that are in the database. They never really abstractly represent the notion of a boat or crossing a river, or what a wolf or a cabbage is, right? So you need a much higher level of abstraction. You need something like human values or Asimov's laws or something like that. I mean, we haven't gone into that kind of AI risk, but we can't even right now say something like be honest to a system or don't use copyrighted materials. Like, even if there's a list of what is copyrighted in the training, if you put that in your prompt, don't use copyrighted materials, the systems don't actually have a deep enough understanding of those terms, and so they can't follow it. So we need to be able to follow those kinds of explicit rules. I don't know how I did on remembering the 7. Those were 4. I've obviously forgotten 3. But that gives you the general gist of the kinds of things that we still absolutely need.
Yeah, the one that you didn't highlight that I kind of really like, because it fits our worldview, which is a knowledge graph worldview, was a representation of relationships between entities.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, like I've been thinking about that essentially my whole career. So you mentioned I was trained by Steven Pinker, and we were really looking at an abstract relationship between a verb and its past tense. And it's a complicated one in English because some verbs are regular, like walk and walked, and some are irregular, like sing, sang. But what I showed in my dissertation was even children could learn that abstract rule. It's an abstract relationship. And then later in my 2001 book, The Algebraic Mind, it was all about abstract relationships. That's where the title came from, right? Algebra is about abstract relationships. And the kinds of stuff you guys are doing are compatible with that. And it turns out that most neural networks, as we currently build them, are not compatible with that. So there may be some neuro-symbolic hybrid much better than we have right now that really kind of smoothly transitions between arbitrary data in, let's say, a corpus database and also having those abstract representations. I just don't see how we succeed at AGI if you can't explicitly represent those when you need to do them, and if you can't, like, take, for example, the data in the Wikipedia fact boxes that are perfectly regular and abstract in certain ways and be able to roll with that. Like, if you can't do that, I don't know what you're doing.
Yeah, that's a very, very good point. And having that said, that you have basically, I started at the beginning with you grilling Sam Altman and OpenAI for valid reasons, I would say. I also read that you've been engaging heavily on the policy side of AI recently. So outside of the Congress hearing, there's been a bunch of activity here. We also had regulators present from the EU. Sometimes EU gets a lot of bashing for that reputation that we here tend to overregulate things and not innovate. I would say this conference could say the opposite. But that aside, what's your opinion?
Can I insert one thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
One thing before the question. There's a false dichotomy between innovation and regulation. Europe has its problems. Some of those may have to do more with like tax incentives and things like that. People try to draw an inference that because you have a lot of regulation, you don't have innovation, and that's just not true. There have been lots of regulations in the U.S. that have led to innovation: safer airplanes, safer cars, safer food, safer medicine. So the idea that those two things are in opposition is just wrong. You might want to look at things like, what is your capital gains tax? What incentives do you offer to startups? It's just a silly. Logically flawed, fallacious is the word I'm looking for. It's a fallacious inference to equate these things. It's just wrong.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And in a way, coming from the ethos of Web3 or decentralized technologies, we also see that it's not just the regulation, it's also how you can embed some rules into the system that are somehow enforced.
Exactly. You need an ecosystem perspective, right? I mean,
exactly.
Like my favorite example these days is airplanes because they're mind-bogglingly safe. Like I take them all the time. As a kid, I worried about it, but I don't worry about it anymore because I understand how well the system works. It's not perfect, but driving's not perfect, walking's not perfect, but it's astonishingly good if you look at the statistics, and it's because there is an ecosystem there, right? There's a whole lot of regulations. There's a whole lot of incentive for innovation. There's multiple layers of regulation about how you build an airplane, how you test it, how you maintain it, how you investigate a crash, and so forth. We need the same kinds of things in AI. And we need to have, tax incentives that make people want to build this stuff. Like, it's an ecosystem, absolutely.
It's a really good point because one of the kind of key components of the ecosystem within decentralized technologies is this fault tolerance notion. For example, in Bitcoin, it's Byzantine fault tolerance that protects the system up to a certain point, which is kind of the same that planes apply. So every part has multiple sort of backups or
fault tolerance is the name of the game. Like you can't do complex engineering without addressing that.
Yep.
And LLMs actually have lots of faults and can't check their own work. And so that's just not the right way to go. LLMs may be embedded with decentralized knowledge. There are lots of things that you can start to think about, but a pure LLM is not fault tolerant.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But yeah, in general, I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the key things in terms of, let's say, regulation in the US, because you're probably or much more familiar with the situation over there. What would you like to see in the next couple of years, and how do you see companies like the big ones, OpenAI, Claude, for example, we saw yesterday, create a new system that takes over the control of your computer, which can be seen as a good thing, but given all we just said, it sounds like an exponential.
What was the quote from Jurassic Park? I'll paraphrase it slightly, but you scientists, built it because you could, but never stopped to think whether you should. Building AI agents at our current level of technology readiness is a bad idea. Now, I think AI agents in the long term are a great idea. They can save us lots of work, expand what it is we can do in this universe. But the problem is the current LLMs, which are the primary technology people are going to use, are not reliable enough. So they've actually crippled their own system. So I think they limit how much you can use credit cards and stuff like that. But as you allow these systems to affect the world, all kinds of things can happen.
So you actually had a great example from the Center of Humane Technology. Tristan Harris mentioned that if you were in a room in the 60s, or everybody would be smoking, right? And then if somebody came to tell you, hey, you should, this should not happen, and at some point people won't be doing it because there will be regulation against it, you'd probably be like, what is this person talking about? But in a way, it sounds quite much like we're in a situation like that today, where some form of regulation, and we believe some form of that regulation will also be in the shape of code, not just in the shape of usual legislation, is going to have to be applied.
It's actually an ecosystem thing again. So, cigarettes, partly, people, at least in the US, smoke a lot less than they used to. There's a lot fewer lung cancer deaths. Some of that is about regulation. Some of it is about tax incentives. Some of it's about what you print on the package. A lot of it is actually cultural. And one place I would really like to see a cultural change in AI is around the use of artists and writers' work without compensation. We need to culturally say that's not cool. Just like, smoking with a bunch of children in a closed room, as happened in schools for a long time, just, turns out to be a bad idea. Secondhand smoking, causes harm to other people. If you train on copyrighted material and you screw the artist, you are hurting society. You are hurting the arts. You are hurting those individuals. And so there we need, maybe a legal change and also a cultural change. I've actually started thinking maybe we need to boycott and say, look, AI is fine, but, we should come back to the regulation question. AI is fine, but if you don't meet certain criteria and you have a form of AI that's sort of like secondhand smoke that causes a lot of harm, well, that's not good. And we're going to, say we're going to wait until you get it better. So what are the harms? Current AI is screwing artists and writers. It's screwing the environment. It's only going to get worse if we keep, following these techniques that are basically about scaling, and so you use a massive amount of energy. They have a lot of bias, including something called covert racism. There's others, but we'll just start with those. So you could say, look, we're not going to use your stuff while you're harming the environment, hurting a lot of people's employment, and also, discriminating against a lot of people. So come back later, and in the meantime, we'll wait. That's a large incentive on these companies. Right now in the US, there's no incentive on these companies to clean up their act. And so, it might be that a boycott's the only way to get there. Back to US policy, because I think somehow we got lost on that. One of the things that I think we need is a pre-deployment kind of thing, kind of like the FDA in the United States, where if you're going to roll something out to 100 million people, I know, because we talked about the agents. Agents would be a great case for pre-deployment testing, independent pre-deployment testing. There should be outsiders that say, hey, how safe is this? What could go wrong? And do the benefits outweigh the risks? And you should have to argue for that in the same way that you would for a new drug. You can't just put a new drug out there and say, hey, everybody, this is going to cure cancer, and not have any data, not look at the side effects. You just can't do that, at least in the United States. It should be the same. If you're going to roll something out essentially to the entire world, as Anthropic, which used to care about AI safety, is doing right now, there should be some kind of independent voice in that. Instead, it's basically up to one guy, Dario. And Dario is looking at Amode is looking at a $40 billion financing. Do you think that that's going to affect his decision? Of course it's going to affect his decision. We saw a few weeks ago, OpenAI released something that they said could be dangerous, might be used to build bioweapons. Like, okay, well, if it might be used to build bioweapons, do the benefits outweigh the risks? Like, let's have companies be required to make that case to some people that don't have money in the game, and have scientific background and so forth. That's probably the single most important recommendation I made in Taming Silicon Valley. Actually, like a third of the book is a short book, but a third of the book is a whole bunch of specific recommendations for what we should do. But if I could have only one, it would be pre-deployment testing. If I could have two, it would probably be auditing after the fact, which we do with cars, right? We look, does this car have a problem? And then we go and deal with it if it does.
That's a very, very good point. We've at the ecosystem of OriginTrail, another thing apart from the decentralization of technology is also the decentralization of governance. So the actual community has the ability to basically direct incentives. So because you mentioned, the incentive here is I'm going to get a big 40 billion raise or whatever, 40 billion valuation raise. So I can sort of throw safety under the bus, right? At some point, if you have the incentives set in such a way, it's very easy to start throwing these under the bus. And then, so the case that we're experimenting and trying to build together as a community is a way where everybody gets to vote actually on chain. So it's an incorruptible vote. And they can get to decide, okay, this particular system, this particular agent project gets certain funds or rewards depending on actually how they act. So there's a feedback loop on a community level. And I'd love to share a little bit more of that with you once the first projects are launching, and they're actually launching today. So super happy to have another conversation at another time and just bounce these ideas, because I believe what we've seen here today is really a new generation of builders in the AI who are challenging not just the problems we're talking about, but also kind of some perhaps ingrained notions, key one of them being centralization. People are sort of building from the ground up based on open source and making something decentralized for everybody, versus the other way around, where kind of the name of the game is to gobble up as much data and infringe as much privacy as you can so you compete with your competitor for a larger valuation. Yeah, perhaps since we have only a few minutes left, any maybe closing thoughts and topics you would like to share before we end?
I'll just make a comment about surveillance and privacy, because that's obviously relevant to you. Decentralization is complicated because of bad actors, and that's probably a conversation for another day. But here's my thought about where OpenAI is headed. And I think it's kind of the opposite in some ways of what you're talking about. I think OpenAI is going to be forced to become a surveillance company. I think it's going to become the most Orwellian name ever, right? They call themselves open, but the code is not open anymore. The measures they're taking for safety are not open anymore. Nothing is open about it. Meanwhile, the economics have not been that great, right? They're spending whatever it is, I wish I could remember, about $15 billion a year on chips or something like that. By their own figures, they're losing spending more than they're earning, about $6 billion a year. So they're making a little bit of revenue, but they're spending a ton of money. And the fact is that LLMs have not been as good for companies as many people believed last year. There was a lot of hype, and then companies start to use it and they find out that it doesn't really work that well, and you have to do a lot of tinkering to get what you want. You can't just use the LLM on its own, et cetera. And so a lot of CIOs, like half of them are disappointed. And the ones who aren't disappointed maybe had lower expectations, I don't know. And so the revenue isn't really there yet to justify this huge expenditure on chips. And then the only idea that people really have for going forward in most of the field is scaling. So that's even more expensive. And so you need even more revenue to justify. Meanwhile, Meta is giving away same tools for free. And so there's a price war. And so it's getting very, very difficult to actually make money. In fact, no of the major companies made profits this year. None of the major LLM companies, unless you want to say like, well, Google made profits on its ads, but they didn't make profits on the LLMs. As far as I know, nobody did except for NVIDIA, which is selling the chips, a different story. So what can OpenAI do to actually make the revenue? I think the only thing they can do is surveillance. And I think there are a lot of signs that they're moving towards that. So they hired Paul Nakasone from the NSA to be on their board. They bought a webcam or a share in a webcam company. And they want to, suck up everybody's files and their calendars, their emails, et cetera. So I think that's going to be OpenAI's play. And I think as you're thinking about an alternative, you should realize there's a way to define yourselves as not supporting that surveillance economy that OpenAI is likely to go hard into, and maybe give alternatives to people who don't want to be part of that.
That's a very well way to put it, Gary. And I wish you were here with us today to see how we were actually approaching this, because we're taking it in a completely opposite direction. We're building something called edge nodes, where anybody can run basically their local node of a decentralized knowledge graph on their device, and they can basically lock it in, keep their data, own it, actually fingerprint it on chain so that they can protect it and even run local models. So obviously all in an open source manner, so you know exactly what's happening. And we have a very interesting builder community, which I would love to have you come and meet at some point. So hopefully next time we get to do this in person. Again, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much. It was great.
And have a great rest of the day.